Autumn, 1823. A small town called Millbrook counts 17 dead in 3 months. What unsettles people isn't the number, it's that everybody passes through one door, the Hartwell funeral parlor. On a routine inspection, a state physician notices what neighbors have learned not to see. What waits beneath that stone house will be buried, by officials and by memory, for nearly a century. If grim corners of American history pull you in, dim the lights and settle close. Let the past speak, while the wind at the window does what wind has always done. Millbrook is 300 souls and a handful of lanes tucked into Pennsylvania hills. Indoor lamplight, outdoor dark. Somewhere else the Republic is booming. Here, life runs on handshakes, hymnals, borrowed sugar, and the unspoken faith that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. In 1801, the Hartwells arrive with a wagon, a purse heavy enough to buy a stone house outright, and a profession the town hasn't seen done properly. Ezekiel Hartwell opens a funeral parlor, clean tables, labeled bottles, spotless floors. Before him, the dead were washed and dressed at home. The carpenter knocked together pine boxes. Now grief seems manageable, civilized. They live above the work. Martha, steady and watchful; Josiah, the careful eldest; Caleb, broad-shouldered; Rebecca, 19 with quiet hands; and Martha's elderly father, Thomas Creed, who spends afternoons beneath the elm paging through an almanac he already knows by heart. The Hartwells go where decent people go: Sunday service, barn raisings, pie deliveries when crops fail. They barter when cash is thin, and that mercy buys loyalty. By 1823, when death comes within 15 miles, the Hartwells close the eyes. October 15th. Dr. Samuel Harrison rides in with a leather satchel, a notebook, and the state's authority to examine wells, larders, and bodies awaiting burial. His job is mostly paperwork and polite nods. He moves with respect, soft-voiced, hat in hand. Because grief is a small room where strangers echo, the Hartwells welcome him with practiced warmth. Their rooms gleam. Instruments line up like disciplined soldiers. Bottles wear tidy labels. The air smells faintly of something sharp and clean. When he asks to see 3 of the deceased, the smiles stay on but harden in the corners. Eleanor Fairchild, 68, officially, consumption. Beneath her collar, ovals like fingertips faintly yellowing. Josiah explains quickly: post-mortem bruising from an awkward angle during preparation. Plausible, not convincing. Marcus Webb, 42, heart attack in the field. Along his arms and chest, precise punctures, too clean for a fall. Ezekiel says he collapsed onto tools. The wounds disagree. Mary Patterson, 26, fever. Along her lips and nails, chalky residue. Harrison's training supplies the word arsenic with a taste that isn't taste at all. The room cools. Martha appears in a doorway, not speaking, her mouth set. Rebecca watches without blinking, older than 19 in the steadiness of it. Caleb drifts closer, not quite blocking the doctor's view, but daring him to look. A leather journal peeks from under folded shrouds. When the doctor leans, Caleb's hand, calm, casual, slides, and the book is gone. At the inn that evening, whispers find the doctor one by one like moths to a lamp. A widow with a handkerchief clutched too tightly says her husband was hearty until he took bad and went fast. The Hartwells were already at the kitchen table, soup steaming, arrangements gentle but firm, the price waved away as kindness. Sarah Peyton says her mother brightened under Martha's visits. 3 days later, the bed was cold and the parlor door opened like a mouth. Harrison flips back through the town's short ledger. The Hartwells arrived with gold enough to buy property, and their first winter coincided with a wasting sickness. That took 8. All of them received beneath that stone roof. People noticed little things, then forgave them sudden declines, discouraging second opinions, burials urged sooner rather than later. Good deeds speak louder than quiet alarms. Night 2. A stooped figure knocks softly at the inn's back door and asks for a discreet consultation. It's Thomas Creed. The frailty is theater. When the door closes, his voice is steady and frightened. "I know what you saw," he says, "and it's worse." He tells Harrison he's being dosed. Not to die quickly, but to be studied. Symptoms noted, timings compared. A long experiment in an old man's body. He's learned just enough routine to throw their measurements off. He says murder wasn't the first crime. It started with grave robbing, rings slid from fingers, gold teeth, burial clothes resold far away. An accident in 1807 with a very sick man proved a terrible fact: death could be staged and believed. Once the line was crossed, the road beyond it never ended. He presses a small ornate key into Harrison's palm. Behind a false wall in the basement, he says, there's a room, shelves of preserved organs, a ledger that catalogues names and methods, a hand-drawn map to a burial ground in the woods. On Sunday, while the Hartwells never fail to attend church and linger after, Harrison must go in and take what proof he can. Creed will slip away toward Philadelphia. Sunday morning. The sky is the color of old pewter. From the trees behind the house, the doctor watches the little procession of respectability, Ezekiel in black that reads, almost clerical, Martha in dark blue with a crisp white collar, Josiah and Caleb, dutiful, Rebecca at her mother's arm, demure. They move like a portrait come to life, exchanging pleasantries along the lane, children laughing as they pass. Evil wears an ordinary face, which is the only face it can wear if it means to be invited in. 30 minutes later, Harrison eases the basement door. The workroom is what it was, orderly, antiseptic, professional. He finds the seam where Creed said to look. The key turns. The dark is not empty, it breathes. Behind the wall, a chamber cut deep into the hillside. Shelves upon shelves of glass, jars that hold pale things, each labeled with dates and observations. In the center, on a lectern, the ledger, heavy, leather, bound, used. The handwriting changes, the voice does not. Entry after entry follows a ritual victim. Approach, method, reactions, notes for improvement. Over months and years, crude poison becomes precise dosing, rough violence becomes controlled experiment. Names slip beyond Millbrook. Other townships where the Hartwells arrive with aliases that rhyme with convenience, offer services, make notes, return later for field study. He writes the way you tear Lennon Swift, hard, committed. Names, dates. Sketches that should never be drawn. Houses talk through their beams. This one has learned to keep quiet. But a footfall is a footfall. The floor above creaks. Voices drift down. Too soon for the end of service. Something has gone wrong. Or, depending on where you stand, right. He scans shelves for a miracle and finds a narrow door half concealed behind tall jars. The passage beyond is low and tight. By candlelight he feels stones scrape his shoulder and steps into a natural cave that exhales colder breath. The smell tells him what the light will confirm: bones on stone ledges, ribs dulled by time. Piles in dark corners where haste outran ritual, rings and buttons and coins in silt. A newer alcove presents the recently dead almost like trophies. Faces he recognizes from yesterday's inspections. Some bodies carry the tidy, curious violence the ledger described. Others were made to vanish quickly. He counts 40 conservatively and knows he is undercounting. Voices again, closer, calm. People who know their own maze. They call his name with patience that chills more than shouting ever could. He finds a fissure hardly wider than a child's shoulder, tears, cloth and skin squeezing through, and exhales into the tree line on the slope above the house. From there he watches the family fan out with grim efficiency. This is not their first search. Others, he understands, did not make it to the trees. He runs a countryman's route, no road, no inn, no predictable place, toward Philadelphia, carrying only his notes and what he'll never again be able to unknow. What he doesn't know is that Thomas Creed never left town. The family found him at the threshold. Payne is a locksmith. He told them the plan, the keyhole, the timing. The Hartwells pivoted without missing a beat. Ezekiel announced a dying relative in Ohio. Neighbors promised to keep an eye on the place. In the dark, the secret room emptied. The cave partially collapsed. Papers burned or were packed into trunks with the neatness of habit. By the time riders from Philadelphia reached Millbrook, the parlor was a clean mouth that had swallowed its own teeth. A few remains were recovered, enough to unsettle, not enough to convict. Friends and parishioners wrote character references in their faces: generous, decent, kind. The report acquired the word officials use when they can't say, "We believe you," and can't say, "We don't." Inconclusive. Harrison doesn't stop. He can't. He follows patterns like a hunter tracks sign he wishes he'd never learned to read. Ohio 1824, 2/5 sudden illnesses, swift burials, a parlor where the price is always right for the grieving. By the time a sheriff believes him, the sign is down, the wagon gone. Then Indiana, then Illinois, then the Missouri frontier. Places where a new name buys a new life if you say it cleanly and shake hands while you say it. Meanwhile, Millbrook dims. The funeral house sits closed and watches the lane for 2 years before a merchant from Philadelphia hurries past the town's caution and turns it into a general store. The basement is sealed in concrete. The hillside is left alone. Trust. The grease that makes small towns move dries up. People start counting favors and suspicious coincidences on the same fingers, and the math never feels right again. Years pass. Harrison writes letters that are read then set aside, rides miles that take pieces of his knees, fills notebooks that make administrators rub their eyes. If you keep your mind on the dead, the living can start to look like they're waiting in line. He becomes a watcher, and watchers are rarely asked to stay for supper. Then 1847. A letter reaches him from the edge of the map, the Oregon Territory, where the frontier is a room with one window and a door that keeps moving as you approach. A sheriff has read an old federal file labeled Hartwell, and in his own notes the handwriting looks like an echo. A family called Caldwell runs a parlor in a little settlement. 30 dead in 3 years, patterns in how people take bad, in how quickly holes are dug, in how paperwork is done with a gracious efficiency that relieves the grieving of thinking too long or too loudly. A raid follows. The room behind that room looks familiar because it isn't a room, it's a plan, and plans travel. Drawers with careful labels, bottles with dates and ratios, a ledger, papers that stitch Caldwell back to Hartwell so neatly it feels theatrical. They're alive, they confess. 8 states, almost 3 decades, more than 120 names that quiet the room when the list is read. Ezekiel, 73, lucid, unrepentant, explains their system like a tradesman addressing apprentices. Martha's recipes for trust, and for what goes into soup when trust gets you into someone's kitchen. Josiah's hands, steady, practiced. Caleb's strength, applied to chores if you don't look too closely at the chore list. Rebecca's eye for those who'll be mourned but not investigated, the elderly with no kin, the chronically ill, the indebted, the traveler expected by no one. How to grow a fast reputation in a new town. How to stage natural death. How to make what won't pass as natural vanish into untroubled ground. It doesn't sound like confession. It sounds like a seminar. Sentences are quick and cold. Ezekiel, Martha, and Josiah hang in Salem that December. Caleb receives life and dies of pneumonia in 1852. Rebecca, claiming coercion, gets 20 years and dies sooner than the calendar suggests she should. Cause is not recorded with care. Before the drop, Ezekiel asks to see the doctor who chased him farther than men usually chase their nightmares. Harrison stands close enough to see the old man's eyes still bright. Surprised you lived this long, Ezekiel says, almost congenial. Several who asked the right questions did not. Harrison doesn't answer. Ezekiel leans in the inch his rope allows. We're trained others. He says, pleased to be handing over one last knot. Family is what you make. He won't say names. He doesn't need to. He leaves the seed where it will grow best, in the imagination of anyone who ever trusted a clean room and a calm voice. Harrison lives a few more years with the volume turned up on every small false note in the world. He dies in 1853, pockets empty of peace but full of notes nobody wanted the first time. The pages find their way into federal files. Paper sleeps. Millbrook fades on its own schedule. By 1860, Forrest takes back beams and stone. The general store becomes a tale, then a memory, then a clearing where the light falls differently for reasons no one remembers. Newspapers misfile. Families choose not to tell certain stories. New people step over old names embedded in floorboards without ever knowing they step on anything at all. What remains is the lesson. Reputation is a weapon when you hold it like one. Institutions meant to comfort can harbor predators because predators draft comfort into their army. And where there is no wire, no shared ledger of warnings, evil can put on a clean apron in one county and start again in the next. It leaves questions that can't be buried with their askers. If the Hartwells trained others, how many front rooms and back rooms are we willing to assume are only front? How many quick burials does it take before a town forgets how to ask why? There are other stories, of course. Towns that told themselves the right lies at the right time and kept living. Towns that learned to ask for second opinions and paid the social price. Towns that sealed basements and left hillsides alone and taught their children that some keys fit doors you should not open unless you bring the right company and the right kind of light. There are rooms much like this one, mind to mind, voice to ear, where people sit and let the past speak, not because they worship it, but because they refuse to be surprised by its habits. If you're still here, you can feel the shape of Millbrook now, the inn with its wandering draught, the church bell that sounds heavier on some mornings, the lane where a man walked thinking about nothing more than fence posts and then stopped because the air felt like a thought he'd forgotten. Some nights the stone house is just a house, and the parlor is only the space grief makes for the living to stand together and try not to stare. Other nights, if you pass by with your hat in your hands, you might think the window blinks. You might think you hear a page turn behind a wall there isn't supposed to be. You might tell yourself stories are just stories, and you'd be right, until you aren't. That's the Hartwell case. Proof that evil prefers respectability to drama, prefers a ledger to a flourish, prefers a routine so boring your eyes slide right off it. Harrison would tell you, if he could. That the cost of seeing things clearly is that you can never again unsee the plain face evil wears. You'll look for it, and sometimes you'll find it where it isn't. Sometimes you'll find it where it is. The skill you're left with is to make your mistakes in the direction of mercy while keeping your eyes open. People ask whether Oregon was the end. It was an end, and the end of the Hartwells, who called themselves Hartwells. But ends come in families too, some like a rope and a crowd holding its breath, some like a daughter saying what she thinks will save her, some like a doctor closing his notebook and admitting the last thing a man does is put down his tools. The town of Millbrook is mostly trees now, roots thread where shelves once stood. A child could walk there and never know a ledger rested on a lectern in the earth. That's fine. Not everything needs remembering. But some things do, and this is one. Not for the Hartwells, they had their say. For Eleanor Fairchild and Marcus Webb and Mary Patterson, and the names that follow and the ones we'll never recover because paperwork burns faster than we can read. If this story sits with you, it's because the past is crowded and present enough to tap our shoulder when we start trusting too easily or not enough. The trick, if there is one, is to listen to the tap and decide, case by case, which way to lean. If you want more of these dark American corridors, tell a friend who walks at night with the same curiosity you do. Stories like this weigh less when carried together. And if you've got a legend from your corner of the map, something half, whispered and hard to shake, leave it. We'll follow the road as far as it goes, and if it vanishes at a tree line, we'll stand and listen for the bell.